I have to use notes because my scattered, scrambled brain can't remember things. So as Noah kindly said, Roshi and I are teaching a program on love and death this weekend. It's one we've taught before. It's one of our top 10 favorites, So because of that, I've been asked to talk a little bit about death. Personally, I'm really feeling the proximity of death. Not so much as a timeline of months and years, no necessarily because of my age or my heart attacks or strokes or ill health, but because I feel it as what? Presence of love. It's a life-affirming presence. So those of us sitting here, and the people who will hear this online, I think you already know that life is precarious. Is that true? You know it's precarious, right? Yeah. Hopefully, contact with that truth as you're also understanding that life is precious. Yeah. But we don't always live as though we knew life was precious, that we knew life was a precious gift. How come? It seems what happens is we get habituated to life. It takes a great deal of effort to wake us up to our love for life. Yeah. Unfortunately, many people don't wake up to that truth until they come close to their dying. Coming closer to death, people begin to realize, that they finally learned to love life. And now it's going. How do we do this? How do we appreciate the preciousness of this life and not forget it? How do we awaken to the truth that each moment is a gift, actually? We know, our practice tells us every context and condition is transitory. Family, friends, possessions, the capacity to see, to swallow, to think clearly when I can, they're all gifts. And all of it will come and go, right? Everything that's born will die. So let's face it, there's no real, true life insurance. As much as they try to sell you this on late night infomercials, yeah. Most of us think that death will come later. How many of you think death will come later? Just raise your hands. Quite a few. Okay. And the rest of you think it might happen here while we're sitting here? It could. Later creates this comfortable illusion, doesn't it, of a safe distance. It's the idea we used to give ourselves a false sense of security in the world of uncertainty. But, change is not later. It's now. And we know from our practice that impermanence is the essential truth woven into the very fabric of life. It's inescapable. It's perfectly natural. It's our most constant companion. Huh? We don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. Huh. It can be beautiful or tragic. Yesterday, Roshi and I were laying in tall grass at 9,500 feet, looking up at a bright blue sky, resting in each other's company and nurtured by the beauty of the place. And then when I was thinking about this talk, I was remembering this woman that I worked with. Whose 8-year-old son died walking home from his grade school. There was no warning, no advanced signs of his death. And even though it was true, and she got to see the little dead body of her boy in the hospital, it was heartbreakingly impossible for her to believe that he had died. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. Embrace the moment, right? That sounds good, right? Sounds really good. We probably heard a dozen or more teachers tell you that. But how do we do that? How do we approach each moment and each gift authentically? Speaking for myself, I think I need to watch the ignorance of my attachments. Consider the unconscious belief that I sometimes hold that an object or a relationship or a situation or a person will last as long as I want them to. We think that attachment keeps things here. We worry that an absence of attachment will cause us to lose what we really love. But nothing we do can keep things from any sort of final way and keep things together in any sort of final way. Does that sound scary? Yeah, sometimes, initially at least. Yeah. However, when we befriend death, when we befriend our mortality, what arises, surprisingly, is love. And we move from attachment to life to love of life. Yeah. And then it becomes perfectly natural to cherish this precious gift of the moment. Like right now, in this moment, I'm looking at my good friend Roshi, and I can see the kindness in her. And I can appreciate the love we share. And I know this moment's going to pass, but I love it right now. I don't know how long either of us will live, if our friendship will be sustained. But appreciating the moment isn't an action taken out of fear or out of worry of regret. It's an act of love. Life's mysterious, isn't it? Wow. I mean, on the one hand, James, we are indestructible and timeless, right? I mean, wow. Every morning when we chant in the morning, we chant the words Avalokiteshvara, whose heart arises moment to moment, a moment to moment arises, Avalokiteshvara, whose heart moment to moment remains. And at the same time, we live in these physical bodies. And they are fragile and subject to all kinds of troubles. It seems to me that this human life of ours is the way we come to reckon with the relative and the absolute in each other and everything. And being human, at least for me, is a way of rating life and death together. In some ways, death is very ordinary, Maybe I've just been around it too much, but I think it's very ordinary. It happens to everybody. And regardless of how we feel about it, we have to reckon with it. So we need to reflect on our death, to come to terms with it. And this is essential for our inner work and in the process of maturing. We need to prepare ourselves for the eventuality of our death. And when we do that, it's also a gift to the people we love. Because, they know we have our act together. And also we can help them, maybe accompany them, or help them to prepare in some way. So the reflection on the truth that I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. That helps me to discover what matters most. To love life. To live more fully, more spaciously, more courageously. It's not morbid. Reflection on death can help liberate us from our habits, from the fear we carry. Oh, so much fear we carry that seems to be connected to our fear of dying. So intellectually we understand this, right? We have read all the books. But our work, I think, is to move that understanding from our intellects and nestle it deep in our hearts. I think denying death is a habit in our country. We don't like to think about it. We want to forget it, deny it, react against it with anger or fear or hopelessness or rebelliousness. And our society colludes in this. And so some of us keep ourselves habitually busy, pretending that if we stay really busy, death can't catch us, And I think for a lot of other people, what happens is that we shut ourselves off from life in the ways that the way we keep death at arm's length. We shut ourselves off from life. And we become withdrawn and afraid to take chances, to fly in airplanes, to try new adventures, to go to the Antarctic. I'm telling you, I told Roshi I'm headed to the Antarctic this year, and I'm still trying to rope her into coming with me. When we don't include death in our life becomes smaller, less alive. But as we age, which is only happening for some of us, I know, but as we age, and we come into more contact with death, friends of ours, relatives of ours die, we naturally start to wonder about when death will come for me. And then we start to wonder about, well, how will I die? Yeah. And truth is, we rarely have any control over that. Like I was facilitating a group of men with AIDS years ago at a house, helping them to explore how did they want to prepare for death? How did they want to meet their dying? What did they want at the time of their dying? What did they want after the time of their dying, etc. It was a great discussion, but I realized that the person whose apartment we were in had left to go to the bathroom, but he hadn't come back. Huh. So I stopped the discussion for a minute and I got up to go look for him, and I found him in his bedroom. He died. Yeah. In the middle of this discussion about how we're going to do it, how we're going to make our plan work. Yeah. Over the years, I've noticed some similarities, I would say, between the dying process and our Dharma practice. You know, both the dying process and the meditative practices can encourage us to loosen our identifications with our ego structure, with our small sense of separate self. Both can relax our grasp on being a somebody. Yeah? Unless you're sitting in the Dharma seat, then it's really hard. The somebodyness, you know, the constructed story that we believe ourselves to be. So there's some other similarities. Let's start with the easy one, which is the withdrawal from our normal routine in everyday life. So when you came to be a resident here at Upaya, you probably stepped away from the life you had before. You know, maybe some activities or some friendships, maybe even an intimate relationship because your partner didn't understand your pursuit of Zen practice, or why you would leave the familiarity and the comfort of your home to go sit with a bunch of people who just want to discover the truth. People who are dying, you know, from long-term illness anyway, they have similar conditions. You know, they don't work anymore. They leave their home sometimes to move into a care facility of one kind or another. And so the concentric circles of their family and friends and community start dropping away one outer ring at a time. That's what I would see a lot. And gradually it comes down to them choosing a much beloved few, usually. People who are committed to stay when the times get difficult, to bear witness to the experience of dying and loss. You know, in a recent session, you were there, with Norman Fisher. Norman gave a talk about how aging offers us the perfect conditions that can catalyze into our awakening. Perfect conditions, he said. And he said, you know, there's a reducing of distractions and atrophying of our habitual emotional and mental patterns. Maybe there's a learned capacity to welcome. Maybe a sense of fulfillment that we've had a life that we've lived completely. And so Norman just kept insisting, this is really good. Getting old is really good. You know? And as you can imagine, all the people in the room with gray hair groaned. Yeah. But he said, though, if you think that your life is about being beautiful and productive, well, that all stopped in your 30s. But if you think that your life is about the growth of wisdom and waking up, then aging is ideal for our practice. You remember? Yeah. And I would add that there are special conditions in the dying process that are conducive, that can positively contribute to our realization of being. See if I can say something about those. So I noticed some other similarities. One is a kind of movement away from consensual reality, I'll call it. That's some of what we're doing here. And it's some of what happens in the dying process. In meditation practice, we recognize that the suffering of the habit of separating the world into opposites, there's a suffering in that, and then trying to cling to what we think is the most positive half. That's one of the ways we suffer. And sometimes in our spiritual practice, and particularly in intensive practice, we discover what I could call the non-dual heart. Yeah. The idea, what's called in some traditions, the inner unity of opposites. The idea of no opposites is central to the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. And what's striking is that this consensus reality is very different from what we will find if we go down the street. That our reality is very different than the consensus reality we'll find if we get down the street. So in dying, there can be also a dissolving of what we might think of as the primary boundaries, I don't know, I and other, yeah? Time and space, mind and body, persona and shadow, yeah? And when there's a coming together and a resolution of these pairs, people open in ways that they hadn't experienced before. And like when people are in bed for months on end, it's a little bit like a retreat, Time can become completely irrelevant. It's not uncommon, Wendy will tell you, that it's not uncommon for people to not be able to distinguish between night and day. Yeah. And sometimes you can see people reaching out from their bed into space, trying to locate themselves in space in a way. The sense of space has changed. And these things, this shift from consensus reality opens us. It loosens our fixed views. And the boundary of persona and shadow, that Jung talked about, it can dissolve, and it opens a door to a greater sense of self-acceptance when it does. Like there was this guy, Charles, in the hospice. He was a very elegant gay man. And when he moved into Zen hospice, he brought with him his very fine crystal champagne glasses, his Spanish provincial silver tea service. And he would hold these very intimate dinner parties on Friday nights for his friends. And although he was a hospice patient, he dressed in Italian suits and silk ties every day. Yeah. Well, now my thing keeps turning off here. Anyway, he did that. He wore his suits until he couldn't anymore, basically. And, gradually he stopped dressing in anything other than his very tattered robe and his, sheepskin slippers. And over time, other elements of his self-image, they started to slip too, And his shadow side started to emerge. And he began grabbing for women's breasts and swearing like a sailor. Yeah. And this was very upsetting, of course, to his friends who were quite horrified by this improper behavior, and so out of character they would mutter under their breaths. But it's not easy to be around people who have these kind of big changes in behavior. But honestly, I was kind of delighted, actually. I was delighted because what I saw was that I saw this as a sign that his contracted sense of self was gradually dissolving. And that it would now become possible for more truth to emerge. Yeah. I also really loved Charles. I just ran into his lover on the streets the other day, and he reminded me of that. That was 30 years ago. Another kind of similarity that we see, right, in the practice of dying and the Dharma practice is that they're both marked by silence. Yeah. You know, the internal dialogue starts to slow down or stop. And we're not so interested in a lot of social commentary or social discussions. Connie, who was had no inner life to speak of, she came to us off the streets, and she lived with us for a while. And she would make these what I came to call practice runs at dying. I don't know how else to call them, practice runs at dying. She'd go into these states that were deep somnolent states that would last for a few hours or sometimes for a few days. They were coma-like, you know, they weren't a coma, but they were coma-like. And when she would reemerge from these, I'd ask her, so, what did you experience? What happened? And she said, I can't describe it. I can't describe it. And then one day, after one of these adventures, and without any prompting, she woke up and she said, Frank, I could tell you something. And I said, well, go ahead, what was it? And she said, if I had known the silence, the quiet was this beautiful, I'd have spent a lot more time in silence. Yeah. There's another thing that I think is common between our practice and dying, and that is a kind of stance of humility. That's how I'd put it. You know, the stark recognition of our ordinariness. You know, we know in our meditation practice that we can see the impersonal nature of all that's appearing and disappearing, right? All the causes and conditions of our life, the natural unfolding of those causes and conditions. And with this insight, sometimes we can come to see that it's not all about me. And we start to develop a greater sense of selflessness. Yeah. The movement towards selflessness is in itself a dying process, you know, dying to the psychological structures of our lives, and the patterns that shape the flow of our lives. There was this guy, Sean, that came to live with us at the hospice. He came on a prison release, actually. And he'd been incarcerated for quite a while, a decade or more, for violent crimes that he'd committed, but now he was dying. He came to stay with us. And he was a real character, the kind of person I really like to work with, you know. And on occasion, we would just fall into these really honest conversations and somewhat unique conversations. And one day, you know, we were sitting on the back porch smoking cigarettes, and he said, Frank, I got off to a bad start. And I said, you did you? He said, yeah, I was born into a house of addicts. And I said, oh, me too. And he said, I didn't ask for that. And so I playfully asked him what he might have asked for when he was in a previous life. Now, Sean didn't believe in reincarnation, didn't give a damn about any of these things, actually. But it was a useful tool to work with imagination, to help him have the freedom to explore with a sense of wonder. And so I suggested that it probably wasn't his dream from a previous life to be fortunate enough to be born into a household where he'd get beat by his father when he was a little kid. Shit, no, he'd say. Who deserves that? He said, if there are previous lives, how come I couldn't come back as an all-star basketball player? And then we'd sit there just on the back porch day after day having these kind of conversations, you know, just playing with the imagination, naming all sorts of possibilities. I mean, there's no way Sean would have ever sat still for a psychotherapy session. This never would have happened. But this playful way worked. And one day he said to me, "Damn, I guess I'm no better or worse than anybody else." Ordinariness. I said, "Yep, just human." And as this guilt that he carried dropped away, and he got okay with his ordinariness, his kindness and his compassion started to show up. I worked at Zen Hospice for 20 years. The only one who ever threw me a birthday party was this guy. And he took his SSI check and his food stamps and put them all together to make a party. What he really wanted to do was to have a stripper who would jump out of a cake. This was his idea of a real good party. But the nurses, and others kind of convinced him that a plain old cake would be just fine. One of the things that happened with Sean is that while he was at the hospice, he made a little video for his son, a son that he'd never known, actually. And in the video, he said something like, "I've never been there for you. You don't even know me. But I'm dying now, and things are getting mighty clear." And he went on to apologize and give this son that he'd never met some fatherly advice. Not so much about how to navigate life or how to stay out of prison, but what had become important to him at that stage of his life, which was love and kindness and forgiveness. It was a big turnaround for him. His defenses came down. He started to open. I would say he opened up to what I might call our innate essential qualities. And this didn't happen because we tried to change him or enlighten him or convert him. We just loved him. We just loved him without reservation. I had a heart attack some years ago. Anyway, I was weak and a mess, and I was lying in bed, trying to rest. And when I would sleep, I'd often have these dreams. And a lot of the dreams were people who I'd gotten to know at the hospice and cared for each other. And Sean was one of them. And sometimes these people would come and give me a little bit of advice or, just say thanks. And sometimes they'd just sit with me. And Sean was one of the ones who would just sit with me. That was the whole dream. Sean just sitting with me. God, I love that man. There's one more thing I want to share about this relationship between Dharma practice and dying. An idea seeped into the culture many years ago, and it became very popular. It was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of dying. Yeah? In her book on death and dying, she proposed 5 stages of grief, actually, but later other people misnamed them as the 5 stages of dying. You know them, everybody knows them. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Now, Elizabeth, who was a psychiatrist, she formulated these images, these stages rather, to name the defensive mechanisms that she saw in the people that she cared for. And in fairness to Elizabeth, who was one of my mentors, by the way, studied with her for a long time, she never saw them as a linear process. In fact, she wrote that any one of these experiences could explode onto the surface of awareness at any time. not in any particular order. So there are no 5 stages of grief. And dying doesn't fit tidily into some neat formula. Yet, I know a lot of hospice workers and palliative care clinicians and others who keep talking about letting go and getting patients to the acceptance stage. And I guess they feel like they've done a good job when people get there. Or maybe there's a box that you check on a chart that tells them that their work is done. Or maybe they imagine it makes for a good death. In my experience, acceptance is still an action of the ego. It's still me choosing to accept. And even there's a kind of bargaining that, like, if I accept, then will I be saved? Or if I accept, will I have a good afterlife? Suzuki Roshi was famous for saying that renunciation is not about giving up the things of the world, but accepting that they go away. So of course, there's a value to letting go and acceptance, right? An acknowledgement of impermanence is invaluable. It helps us to learn how to die. And it reveals the flip side of loss, which is that letting go is an act of generosity. When we let go of old grudges, we give ourselves to peace. When we let go of self-sufficiency, we give ourselves to the care of others. When we let go of clinging, we give ourselves to gratitude. When we let go of fixed views, we give ourselves to not knowing. And in my experience, acceptance, it's not the final stage. It's the beginning of a process of transformation. What I've witnessed in being with people who are dying is, who has a napkin or a tissue? Anyone?
Yes.
I know I'm not supposed to do this in the Zendo, but I don't want to leak. So what I've witnessed in dying is a kind of stripping away process. Yeah, all the ways we've defined ourselves. You know, I'm a mother, I'm a father, I'm a Buddhist teacher, I'm a rich person, I'm a poor person, I'm a success, I'm a failure. All the ways we've defined ourselves are either gracefully given up or they're stripped away by dying. Then who are we? They all go. And this can bring on a state of chaos, actually. A state of chaos for us.
Right.
Sorry, I thought I heard it. Yeah, okay. Come on up. We're quite informal here. At least when I'm here. Thank you very much. It's kind of you. Just one. Thanks very much. Thank you. So this falling away or the stripping away, this gracefully giving up, however it occurs, it brings on this state of chaos. And people get confused when they lose their reference points. Things that have defined them, confined them. This chaos is a kind of identity crisis. And some people thrash around in beds and they pull on their clothes or they become very restless. And in medicine, we tend to pathologize that state and frequently medicate it. Because it's disturbing to sit with. So when I'm with a family or someone who's going through that, I try to create a warm and open environment, a non-judgmental space in which whatever needs to happen can happen. I don't know what's supposed to happen. We'll see. Someone once asked me if I was worried about opening Pandora's box. I said, no. So this capacity to do this is best done if I can become a refuge to myself. If I can pause and call on the better parts of my nature. If I can discover shelter for my habitual defensiveness and reactivity, or my neurotic tendencies that cause me to become overwhelmed. Look, we can't always eliminate difficult conditions. It's just not possible. Sometimes anti-anxiety medications is the right intervention. But usually I just try to start with the least intrusive thing. We can be the one calm person in the room, not the problem solver, but the portal to another possibility. And when we do that, we can become a refuge to others. A woman I know traveled a very long distance to be with her father, who was dying. And the clinicians that were caring for him and his other caregivers and his wife had chosen not to tell him that he was dying. And he was at that stage of confusion that I was just describing, a kind of chaotic state. And when his daughter came and sat down opposite his bed, he didn't recognize her and thought she was somebody else. And so he began to pour out these very distressing and unflattering stories about his daughter. You know, how she had left him and the family and how selfish she was. And it was painful for the daughter to hear these things, of course. And, you know, she had hoped for a different kind of experience, traveling all this distance to be with him. But she was very brave and very stable. And she continued to stay with him over the next few days as he came close to death. And gradually, you know, he got quieter and he was sleeping more of the day, and he'd wake up, you know, from these sleeps, you know, with a sound or a look of confusion or some tender tears or a question. And in one of those moments, he asked her, "What's happening?" And she courageously and very lovingly said, "Daddy, do you think you might be dying?" And at first she wasn't so sure that this was the right thing to do, and maybe she had overstepped her position. And but he got a little agitated, but she remained calm. And she could sense something changing in him. And she knew that she should stay close and do nothing. That's a really good instruction. Stay close and do nothing. And sometime later, thanks to her loving company, I think, and he died very peacefully. And it really was a healing between them that's changed her whole life going forward. Okay. Look, I'm going to say one more thing, Noah. Surrender is not the same thing as letting go. It's infinitely deeper than acceptance and letting go. You know, in letting go, we have this feeling of distancing ourselves. We get free from something by distancing ourselves from it, right? We set it down or we step away from. But in surrender, it's a wholly different experience. It's a feeling of expansion, actually. And you feel like you're coming closer to something, not moving away from something. And there's a freedom in it because that expansion allows you to include everything. Yeah. Surrender is the doorway to transformation. And so if we just stop at acceptance, we're not going all the way. And change isn't transformation. Things will keep changing, but that doesn't mean you will be transformed. Transformation means that you are completely recreated, I'll say. And you're now functioning from an entirely new vantage point. And that's what happens in the dying process if people are supported well. Surrender is when we stop fighting. Have you ever had the experience in sitting sesshin where you've been pushing hard and doing the best you can, and you feel the opening of that something's coming, you know? You feel that something's coming, but you're just so tired, you don't know if you can do it. There's a lot of things that give rise to surrender. Faith, love, religious traditions, etc. But the thing that I've noticed most is exhaustion. And we find that when we're sitting sesshin, don't we? There's exhaustion. And then that exhaustion allows us to open to something that we couldn't possibly see before. So there's more things I want to say to you, but maybe we'll say them on the weekend. But I want to, there's one thing I want to end with, which is that it's a ridiculous gamble to imagine that you will, at the time of your dying, you will have the strength of body, the emotional stability, the mental clarity to do the work of a lifetime. The time for the conversation is now. Yeah. So thank you for letting me engage you in that. And I appreciate your kind attention, and I hope there's been some very small value to my words in your life. Thank you. Thank you, Noah.